and Verizon. Stay tuned. Up next is the People Power Lunch Hour Show. Hello, and welcome to the 100th episode of the People Power Lunch Hour Show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber, and we're here live in Center City from Philly Cam's studios. And today, because it's a special episode, it's number 100, we want to dedicate it to an issue that's close to my heart. We're going to talk all about Puerto Rico. So today in the studio, I'm joined by community organizer and friend Fermin Morales. He's been working on a myriad of issues here in the city for a long time. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about the situation in Puerto Rico. A lot of people have been messaging me and calling me, wanting to know what's going on with the political situation there. So for that reason, we're going to give you a little bit of background and history and talk about all of the things that are bringing us to this point now, a second wave of protests and mass mobilizations on the island. But first, before we get into that, I want to kind of go back to our first episode and the reason why we started this show, the People Power Lunch Hour Show. It was November in 2016. I think some of you remember that as a kind of a dark, tumultuous time. But after the election of Donald Trump, a lot of people were expressing a lot of emotion, a lot of anger, a lot of despair, especially on social media. And we wanted to offer a solution to people who felt helpless, who felt like they couldn't do anything about what was about to happen. And what we decided to do was a show that featured people all around the city who are working on an array of really important social justice issues. Here in Philly, it's a very active city full of a very vibrant activist community. And we have people working on everything to education reform and safe schools, to drug policy reform, to decarcerating Pennsylvania. We have environmental issues. We got people working on labor and employment issues. Again, there's people literally working on everything you can think of. And so we wanted to showcase those people, have them educate the public about these issues, but most importantly, tell them how they could get involved, how to channel all of that emotion, all of that energy, that despair into something positive. And so we've interviewed probably over 200 people in the last couple of years in doing this show, and it's really, really been amazing. So I want to shout out all of the people that have been past guests on the People Power Lunch Hour Show. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and for encouraging people to take action, get involved, and be part of the solution here in Philadelphia. You know what they say, think globally, act locally. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest. He, again, is an activist, community organizer here in Philadelphia. I met him at a protest, I think on Market Street, that was for Puerto Rico. And I'd like to welcome Fermin Morales to the show.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here, and just want to let you know that our struggle continues as a nation of people. Most people don't know that Puerto Rico is a nation. It is a nation, even though it is colonized by the United States. That doesn't mean that we forfeited being a nation. We have continued to maintain our identity, maintain our language, our culture. We have our heroes, we have our poets. And though our situation is not well understood by a lot of people, let's see if we could bring a little bit of understanding of who we are and the type of work that the diaspora of Puerto Ricans who have to fled the island because of economics or different situations, because natural catastrophes and stuff like that. But that doesn't mean that we have a diaspora that doesn't love the place they came from. We have a diaspora that actually wants to work here to make things better for the people in the island and for those here that are also struggling to make ends meet.
So, Fermin, before we get into all of that, I want to know how long you've been in activism, and what inspired you to kind of, get out there in the community and do what you do.
I think what motivated me to do things was, well, I grew up in the city of Philadelphia, and I've been living here pretty much all of my life. But certain things happen, and you see certain things affect you in a way that may be different than other people. And most people here who are basically brown or black people go through things that other people sometimes don't go through. And sometimes it's difficult for them to understand it because they've never been through those circumstances. So it's either you accept those things and learn to say to yourself, I'm willing to accept this load on me or this oppression, or I'm willing to fight it and let people understand that I should be treated as their equals. And so that is what happened with me, and I'm sure that happens with a lot of other people when they decide to fight back, because you get in a point in your life where you decide whether you're going to accept something or you're going to fight it. And I choose the latter. I choose to fight it. And so I probably started getting involved around, because of the racism that I did go through, about the age of 27. And some of the work I started to do was on issues that affected Latin Americans, basically with different types of blockades, the blockades to Cuba, how they've invaded Latin American nations and basically destroyed their economy, unstabilized them, and then they have mass immigration to other places. And then finally I decided to struggle and realize that I am Puerto Rican, and that is my identity, and I wanted to fight for Puerto Rico.
That's great. Again, it's wanting to stop being oppressed, wanting to fight back, and not be complacent about the current situation. So again, in order for people to understand what's happening now in Puerto Rico, again, if you haven't been aware, hundreds of earthquakes have been hitting the island. There was 2 really big ones and many other aftershocks. It has really devastated the southern region of Puerto Rico. There's over 20,000 people right now sleeping outside in camps, either because their homes are destroyed or they're unsafe, or they're just afraid of further damage and earthquakes. And there's a current controversy right now where the government has failed to provide emergency relief supplies to the community. And the public uncovered over a dozen warehouses full of supplies that were from Hurricane Maria. As a result, people have been taking to the streets the last few days at the governor's mansion, La Fortaleza, and demanding that she resign or demanding accountability. And again, in order to understand that situation, we kind of need to go back, right? And I think that a lot of people have a misunderstanding about what is Puerto Rico. It's not a state. Is it part of the U.S.? Some people call it another country. There's a lot of confusion. So the first thing is that, legally speaking, it's one of the U.S. territories. It's considered a Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. It is not a state, and it is not an independent country. But oftentimes people refer to it as the oldest colony. Can you talk about Puerto Rico's colonial status?
Well, it really started with Spain. It really started that Spain had Puerto Rico as a colony. And just like in any other colony around the world, you treat people indifferently. You don't treat them as equals because you've dominated them. Usually you dominate them because you have more weapons than they do. And you see the reason to go there because you can make plenty of wealth. And so with Spain, it was basically that Spain looked at it as a garrison, basically because it had other countries in the region that were part of their colonial, they're part of their colonies also. So Puerto Rico was more like a trampoline to attack all these other Caribbean nations, and so they would prepare Puerto Rico for that. It was more like a garrison. When Spain was losing its empires and people were rebelling, and finally a lot of these countries became free, there was also rebellion in Puerto Rico and Cuba, which were the last two remaining colonies of Spain. There was the Grito de Lares in Puerto Rico that finally started to let people know that Puerto Ricans were not Spaniards, and that Spaniards didn't really treat Puerto Ricans as equals. And so in that rebellious period, Spain was forced to realize that it had to give Puerto Ricans rights. And they finally gave Puerto Rico a status called autonomy. Autonomy is a status where, even though Spain was still involved in the island, Puerto Ricans were able to finally trade with the rest of the world, were able to send goods around the world, and had trade agreements with the rest of the nations in the world. As after being invaded by the United States, Puerto Rico was blockaded by the United States. That situation that they had as a nation that was autonomous, that privilege was taken away by the United States. It no longer had that privilege. And with that blockade, you would see a lot of the shipments that would go, that were supposed to be shipped to Europe, to different parts of the world, would stay in the San Juan port because they couldn't be shipped because the status had changed. And this created a chaos in Puerto Rico. And then the situation got worse. Instead of helping us out and basically supporting our economy, they displaced it and made us dependent on their economy. Because at that particular time, easily 85% of the land was in Puerto Rican hands. After that, after the displacement of Puerto Ricans, that land was taken over by the United States. And it was made to produce sugar cane for 4 different companies. There were absentee companies. The owners were absentee. And it's basically, you take a nation that was once self-dependent, could survive on its own, and you made it dependent upon you, and now its people become dependent upon you. And you basically destroyed an economy basically in 1898 with that 2-year blockade that you have. To me, the period we're going through now, it seems like a second invasion, because after so many years, we were able to fight back and start to build our institutions again. We had the electricity was in the hands of the Puerto Ricans. Our educational institutions, which are now creating doctors, engineers, people that work for NASA, doctors, lawyers, it's in the hands of Puerto Ricans. One of our universities, the Mayagüez, is considered one of the 1,000 best universities in the world. And when you put a fiscal control board, you basically, now you have austerity measures. It's basically to destroy our institutions. And so this is like the second invasion of Puerto Rico to try to destroy us again as a nation, you know.
So, just to kind of build on that, after the Spanish-American War, Spain loses the war, and then as part of the treaty and the concessions that Spain has to make, they give Puerto Rico and the Philippines to the United States. And that's how Puerto Rico becomes a territory or property of the U.S. government. At that point, Puerto Ricans are not citizens. They're not independent. They're sort of under this, blanket protection of the U.S. government until the World War starts, right? And then the United States needs more soldiers, needs to draft more soldiers and conscript them. And so they allow Puerto Rico to be U.S. citizens, Puerto Ricans to be U.S. citizens. And by becoming U.S. citizens, that allows them to be part of the military and join the war effort.
Yes, I think that's what most people don't realize. And one thing most people don't realize is that we have a Puerto Rican citizenship that people don't talk about. And it seems like some people in Puerto Rico are willing to accept that citizenship, and other nations are also willing to accept that citizenship. But when you talk about from 1898 to 1917, Puerto Ricans did not have U.S. citizenship. But entering World War I, the Americans needed soldiers. They needed people they said should be loyal to them. And one way they thought that Puerto Ricans would be loyal to them is by making them citizens and putting them to fight wars. We didn't want the citizenship, but it was basically forced upon us. But it was forced upon us to fight in their wars. Now, some people understood that and others did not. But since 1917, Puerto Ricans have had to register and fight in American wars, whether they're imperialistic wars or whatever wars, to defend an American government that has never had their own interest of the Puerto Rican people. Yet some people are actually don't realize this. They don't realize that this is what happened. And basically, when you see this and not realize what they've done to your island, you have to ask yourself the question, what are you fighting for? If you're really fighting for freedom, why hasn't that freedom come to you? And why you haven't put that in your head, to have a thought in your head to say, what am I really fighting for? And not just go blindly fight for something, because you're giving your blood. You may come back psychologically messed up. You may come back with issues affecting you because you may have done stuff that you're not very, very fond of, or it's starting to hurt you in your head.
And that's right. There's been hundreds of thousands of veterans from Puerto Rico that have served in all of the wars, including the wars that are going on right now. So again, just building on that history, throughout this entire time, from 1898 up until today, there's always been people organizing and fighting for independence, right? There's been many notable leaders in Puerto Rico who have fought for the right to be an independent nation. Those people, in every instance, were either brutalized with violence, killed, arrested, and or imprisoned. Some disappeared. We never saw them again. There's people still currently serving in federal prisons who have fought for independence of Puerto Rico. One of the people who recently was released from Puerto Rico, Oscar Lopez, who's living in Puerto Rico now. I think a lot of people are familiar with Abisu Campos, another important historical figure. And so in Puerto Rico, there's always been several constituencies, right? Just like any nation, any group of people, it's not monolithic by any means. There's been people that are pro-independence. There's people that are who are loyal to the U.S. government, who want very much for Puerto Rico to become a state and integrate and assimilate into the United States. And then there's people who either want to keep it the same, like just keep things the way that they are, or people who just don't really know, can't form an opinion on it. And so you have all of these different constituencies in Puerto Rico with no real clear majority. And with the independence movement, it's really been hard to let that build because it's been suppressed by militarized police and criminalized anytime that, people really try to organize folks into independence movement. There's a famous event in Ponce, Puerto Rico, outbreak of police violence and a lot of bloodshed, for the people that organized there. So what does it mean to be a colony? Well, a couple of things that you should know. People who live in Puerto Rico right now, they cannot vote in presidential elections. So they can vote in the primary, right? The Democratic Party, Republican Party can take, the votes from Puerto Rico and include that in their candidate choice for president. But when the general election happens in November, people in Puerto Rico are not allowed to vote for president. And that also includes people in the Virgin Islands who are their neighbors, right? And people in the Mariana Islands and Guam. None of them can vote for president. The second thing that's really important is though there's a representative in Congress, that person is not a voting member. So Puerto Rico cannot elect senators or Congress representatives that can vote for them. They can't really co-sponsor bills. They're not actively participating in the democratic process. So right now we have an impeachment trial, right? The House voted on articles of impeachment, Senate to the Senate. Now the Senate is, going to have a trial. The senators will vote. Puerto Rico has no say in that, right? There's no representatives that can vote either for or against impeachment. And so that leaves a real lack of representation and a lack of voice. As they say, taxation without representation. DC is in a similar boat, like District of Columbia, for not also having, senators or congressional representation in that same way. The other thing that I think is important to note is that Puerto Rico owes, allegedly, a really huge debt that's in the billions of dollars. This debt comes from a variety of different places. It's really not the debt from the people. It's not like people of Puerto Rico overspent money and they owe this debt. This debt is really a debt to Wall Street, right? And as that debt mounted, because of bad government contracts and arrangements that were made by some people that did not have Puerto Rico's best interest, that debt, needed to have some kind of resolution, according to the folks in Wall Street. So they really lobbied the Obama administration. Yes, President Obama. And as a result, Congress passed and Obama signed into law the Promesa Bill. The Promesa Bill essentially established a fiscal control board at Puerto Rico that are not elected. They're appointed by Washington. And the purpose of that fiscal control board is to oversee all of the financial decisions and economic decisions in Puerto Rico. And again, this is another instance where the people of Puerto Rico did not elect them and don't have a say over this governing body and making the decision for them when it comes to their money. So can you talk about the Fiscal Control Board and why this entity is bad for Puerto Rico?
Well, the whole thing really started is that there were companies in Puerto Rico that were 936 companies. They were companies that would come to Puerto Rico. They were not taxed for 10 years. And a lot of them, whether they were pharmaceuticals, whether they were for fish products or whatever it was, they would come in and they wouldn't pay taxes for 10 years and they would actually do business in Puerto Rico. That means there was no money invested in the economy of Puerto Rico. That means there's no money invested in the infrastructure of Puerto Rico. You can't have companies come to Puerto Rico and become tax havens, and no one's going to benefit in Puerto Rico because none of those tax money is going to go to help the local economy. So this is how you do business in Puerto Rico, sort of like you have like a Swiss bank account where you don't pay taxes in a Swiss bank account. And so it all started with that and with the previous administration when they got rid of the 936s. They didn't have a plan on how to foment an economy in Puerto Rico that would be a local economy. So the economy started to go into a recession. As it started to go into a recession, Wall Street, they were placing bonds on Puerto Rico, basically to see if anything happened, whether the economy grew or it did not grow, these bondholders still have to get paid. And there were also Puerto Rican bondholders involved also in this situation. But the economy was in a recession before the American economy was in a recession in 2008. And so after a while, they started to realize that they couldn't pay these bonds, these bondholders, that the Puerto Rico was accumulating debt after debt after debt from borrowing. And so now you got to pay these bondholders. If it was in a situation where I invested in something and all of a sudden it didn't turn out right, I would lose all my money, not Wall Street. We hate the word socialism, but there's no other place that socialism is practiced more than in Wall Street. And so now you have a situation where you have to pay these people. So where do you take this money out of to pay these people? Well, you obviously have to cut wages. Obviously you have to cut money that goes to different programs to pay these bondholders who knew it was already a risk because Puerto Rico was in a recession. So they can't lose. That's why you get into bonds in Wall Street. But guess what? There were people in Puerto Rico that also had bonds and stocks. They're not getting paid. So if this is not a discriminatory practice against Puerto Ricans, this is another example of discriminatory policy towards Puerto Ricans. So how are people going to be affected? Well, if you're going to make cuts, you're making cuts to pensions, you're making cuts to health care, you're making cuts to education, you're making cuts to the universities. These are all the programs that people need to succeed. Just to pay a bunch of bondholders, you mean they can't take a hit for all the dumb stuff that they did, knowing well that we were in a recession? Why aren't they being penalized? Why are the masses of people in Puerto Rico being penalized?
Yeah, and as you talked about, those austerity measures are being imposed by this fiscal control board, right? They basically dictate what programs and services need to be cut. And I'll just bring up one of those things because it's really relevant to what's happening today. It was the fiscal control board in its, austerity measures that essentially forced the University of Puerto Rico, to cut funding for its seismic science program, right? The same department that was doing research on earthquakes and seismic activity. And so again, just one of the examples of, this board that's not been elected by the people making decisions that really impact people's lives in a negative way. There were big protests and huge outcry when cuts to the University of Puerto Rico were made. And all these cuts to government programs resulted in thousands of layoffs, right? So many government workers lost their jobs. And probably one of the most sinister things that happened is that hundreds and hundreds of schools were closed in Puerto Rico. And because so many schools closed, people didn't have where to send their kids to school or had to go much further to send them. And we know now that one of the people responsible for closing the schools, Julia Kelleher, has been arrested not once, but twice for corruption. For that same reason, for the closing of schools and for contracts that she made that would benefit her and her friends' companies. She's actually from the Philadelphia area. So again, there's ties for these people to Philadelphia. And she was arrested this week, for corruption for the second time. So a lot of people are against this fiscal control board for that reason. They have, again, taken away the rights of Puerto Ricans to make decisions for themselves or to empower their elected officials to make those decisions. And again, a lot of people have commented that these cuts are cruel, they're dehumanizing, and they're based in racism, right? And that because Puerto Rico is not a state, it cannot file for bankruptcy like other states can do. So if this were happening in Pennsylvania, per se, the state of Pennsylvania could file for bankruptcy and then make an arrangement with the creditors, or some of the debt could be wiped out. So many organizers have been calling for the debt to instead be canceled since they can't file for bankruptcy, and for a removal of that fiscal control board. So if you're just tuning in, you're listening to WPPM and Philly Cam TV, and this is the People Power Lunch Hour Show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. I'm here with my guest, Fermin Morales, and we've been talking about the political situation and history of Puerto Rico. When we come back, we'll talk more about the recent protests that happened over the summer that removed Governor Rosselló, the recent earthquakes that have hit the island and its impact on the people in the southern region, and the second round of mass mobilizations that have been taking place this week in San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Hello, welcome back to the People Power Lunch Hour show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber, and this is our 100th episode of the People Power Lunch Hour show. We are so excited that we've been able to produce this many episodes and interview so many great people all around the city. Because it's a special episode, I wanted to talk about an issue that's near and dear to my heart, and also something that's really timely and relevant because there's a lot of things happening this month that's keeping Puerto Rico in the news. In the first half hour, I was joined by my guest, Fermin Morales, and we've been giving a little bit of history and overview of Puerto Rico's sort of political situation. Why are we in the situation that we are in today? So we talked a little bit about how Puerto Rico was first colonized by Spain, then the United States, and how, the different movements and constituencies in Puerto Rico have, often conflicting views on how the country should move forward. So in the second half hour, we're going to talk about some more recent events that have also been huge media sensations, especially last summer. Last summer was a huge historical moment for Puerto Rico. There were literally millions of people protesting, mobilizing in the streets after a huge scandal broke out with Governor Ricky Rosselló. So again, I'll just give you a brief overview of what led to that scandal, and we'll talk about the impact that it had in terms of building a movement to fight against injustice. So back around May, as I mentioned earlier, several people from Rosselló's administration were arrested by the federal government on charges of corruption. Shortly after, the Center for Investigative Journalism in Puerto Rico was able to share thousands of documents and leaked text messages that showed that the governor was engaged in, some really really bad behavior. Those text messages were among himself, some of his pals, and people in his own administration that included homophobic and sexist comments, a lot of really crude jokes. There's a lot of like bad memes. Looked more like a chat group that you'd have with a bunch of college students. But this was, in fact, the governor of Puerto Rico and his cronies trading text messages and jokes, making fun of people and complaining about people in government and about the public. Those text messages again became public, and people of Puerto Rico were very, very angry. I think the thing that really angered people the most were the text messages where they made fun of the dead people, the people who died in Hurricane Maria. So during Hurricane Maria and its aftermath, over 4,000 people died in Puerto Rico. And a lot of people are still grieving over those losses and recovering from the situation that hurricane brought. And just to go back to the hurricane, because I think we skipped over that part, a Category 5 hurricane hit Puerto Rico in 2017, and it completely devastated the island. Very much in the same way that last summer we saw that Category 5 hurricane hit the Abaco Islands in Bahamas. So mass devastation, homes that were completely destroyed, floods everywhere, landslides. Roads were blocked, and there was no power on the island. In some places, they went up to 8 months to a year without power. My own family went 6 months without electricity and 6 months without water on the island. And many people depended on the help of neighbors, strangers, and other mutual aid being provided by members of the diaspora and other nonprofit groups and churches that came to give relief to the island. One of the biggest things that frustrated people with the Trump administration and FEMA was the delayed response of FEMA to provide disaster relief to the people of Puerto Rico. And till this day, FEMA still has not released $18.5 million in aid to the island. Congress sanctioned that money, they authorized it, and they even gave HUD a date of September 4th to release that money. So really we have two departments, FEMA and HUD, who have been holding on to relief monies and delaying aid to the island throughout this entire time. Again, it's now January 2020. HUD still has not released that money to the island. On top of that, a lot of people feel that Rosselló's management of the hurricane and the relief effort was also very poor, that the island was completely unprepared to deal with a situation like that. And furthermore, that there were serious problems with the infrastructure to the electrical grid that were identified prior to the storm that were not addressed. And so a lot of people put the blame squarely on Governor Rosselló. So given that happened in 2017, in 2019, when these text messages came and some of them were making fun of the people that died during the hurricane and afterwards, this, I think, was the straw that broke the camel's back. So a lot of people were very, very upset. It didn't matter what party you were from. There was just a general feeling of anger towards the disrespect. And one thing about Puerto Ricans, right, it's like you can't disrespect people like that without getting something in return. So we had a lot of celebrities get involved, like Residente, Bad Bunny, even Ricky Martin was referenced in the text. Again, they were making these homophobic remarks around him. And millions of people took to the streets in the largest ever mass mobilizations in recent history in Puerto Rico. They even did a general strike shutting down work on the island for a day. And they did this until they finally forced the governor to resign. Not only did he resign, several members of his cabinet resigned and or were arrested for corruption. And this left the island in a very precarious state. The governor tried to appoint a new Secretary of State before he left and make him the governor. He's also the attorney for the Fiscal Control Board, so there was a huge conflict of interest there. That didn't last very long. And finally, the Senate acted and the courts decided that the new governor would be Justice Secretary Wanda Vasquez. So that's who's been in power now. Vasquez was the only one who wasn't on the text message, group. But there are many other documents that were leaked originally from the Center for Investigative Journalism that shows that she's implicated in other, questionable behavior. That brings us to where we're at now. So before we get there, can you talk about being in Philadelphia and being part of the diaspora and sort of seeing everything that's going on last summer and seeing this kind of resurgence of activism and interest in Puerto Rico? You were out there, of course, in the streets protesting. Can you talk about that experience last summer?
Well, when you have, right now we have a dictatorial board. We're not being governed by who actually wins the elections in Puerto Rico. We're being governed by a dictatorial board, which is the Fiscal Control Board, which is the 7-member board, which are, some of these are the big banks in Puerto Rico, Santander and Banco Popular. One of its members of the board is from Philadelphia. He's a University of Pennsylvania professor named David Skeel. This nice young fella, as they say. And he's one of the people that are destroying Puerto Rico at this moment. Once you have a stranglehold on the population and they're already suffering from these cuts, and then you have supposedly an administration that is supposed to help the people of Puerto Rico with what's left of the money that's there, and you see a bunch of people that are incompetent, a bunch of people that are inconsiderate, and at the same time, play bipartisan politics. And then it all comes out because nowadays everything comes out because it's on Twitter, it's on Facebook, it's on social media. Now people are really indignated. They're really mad. And to put it into perspective, as a nation, and you haven't seen this in many nations around the world, you can look it up, where there's such a big mass mobilization that practically 1/3 of the population was involved in this mass protest. You don't see this in many nations around the world. You certainly don't see it in the United States. And to go over there and feel indignated, and the best thing I liked about this whole thing when they were marching is that they said a slogan that said, we're more than you are, and we're not afraid. They're telling the government of an oppressive government. First of all, the oppressive government is the United States. And second, it's its lackeys in Puerto Rico, that we're not afraid no more. We're more of us than you are. And that is the turning point in any struggle, is that when we stop being afraid of our oppression and we start deciding that we need to be free. And that's part of freedom, is to stop being afraid. And so that part of it is something that I saw that was building up. But it builds up because there are people talking about this. There are people that are actually educating people and saying you are a colony. For so many years, we were told that we were a free associated state. We were lied to. And people bought this lie because you repeat a lie 100 times and people believe it. But then when people start seeing this actual situation and what happened when your government's taking control by this board and you no longer control anything you do, then people start waking up. And by preaching and sending this message consistently, people finally broke up. And this was like the straw that broke the camel's back. And people decided enough is enough. And I think right now, when the protests that you see now, with all the stuff that's happening, after the earthquake that just went, and the bad administration that is there, and people have to start questioning themselves, why are these people governing? Why are these people even there? Why can't you just get all these damn people out of there? just take that whole party of people and just get rid of them because they don't serve anybody's interests but their own, not the people that they're supposed to serve.
Right. And one of the other things that was revealed with all of these leaked documents and the investigation by the Center for Investigative Journalism is that so many of the government contracts that were given out by Rosselló were given to groups that had hired his friends as contractors. And that means that they were getting a percentage of all of those government contracts. They call that pay to play. So they basically set up these consulting firms and they said, hey, if you want a government contract from Rosselló, you have to hire one of our firms, right? KOI being one of the more famous ones. You have to hire one of our firms and then you'll get the contract. And then sure enough, the majority of the people who hired those firms then in fact did get those government contracts. And those consulting firms took a percentage of those contracts. These are not just random friends. These are like childhood friends of the governor, right? They go way, way back, people that he's known for a very long time. So that's another reason, again, people said like, okay, our money, we're not taxing these corporations that are coming here to do business for free. A fiscal control board is here, making us pay back this debt that is not really ours. We didn't, make those contracts or buy those bonds. And the same board is also instituting all of these fiscal control measures and austerity measures that basically cut all of our programs. And with the little bit of money that's left, we're going to give those contracts to friends of the governor. And in many instances, those services were never rendered. So they were given money for these services and they never delivered the services. So it's a lot of things going on right now. And because so many people were involved in these schemes, one has to wonder, like, is there anyone left that we can trust, or do they all have to go? And I think that's an ongoing debate right now in Puerto Rico where, I think a conversation has to happen. We're here in the United States, so we're looking at it a little bit differently. But people in Puerto Rico need to be the ones to decide for themselves, what they're going to do about this crisis in government, because it's a real lack of trust in the leaders to be able to, one, be good stewards of the money, to make good decisions and good contracts on behalf of the people, to protect and defend the people. And finally, in knowing how to manage a crisis when one comes. So we've had two, right? Hurricane Maria and now these earthquakes. So I want to kind of go, we have about 12 minutes left to talk about the recent earthquakes that have been happening in Puerto Rico. Again, I want to clarify a few things. One is that there's a lot of misinformation going around about the cause of earthquakes. I'm not a seismologist, but I would encourage people to really do their research before sharing videos, sharing memes, and sharing information that's not based in scientific evidence and research, right? There's people claiming that fracking is causing the earthquakes. Right now, we don't really know. There's a lot of questions. We haven't discovered, there's no definitive proof or evidence that there's fracking going on in the island. People are talking about offshore drilling. People are talking about, water injection sites. Those are all potential things. But again, before you circulate information and people talking at length on social media, I'd encourage you to fact check it and make sure the information is accurate, because I've just seen so many videos that are not accurate. And I think that really spreads hysteria and misinformation. So these earthquakes hit Puerto Rico. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it happened in the southern region. Primarily, in the epicenter has been a town called Guayanilla. And that part of the island is very, very poor. A majority of the people live under the poverty line. So it's not like they're hitting wealthier communities in the northeastern. Yeah. Not in the northeastern part of the island. This is a very, very poor region. A lot of the homes have been damaged. Not everything is what you see in the pictures, which is like a house is completely crumbled. What you're seeing more often is like cracks in the foundation and the infrastructure of a home, which make it structurally unsafe. And again, hundreds and hundreds of aftershocks and tremors, which don't allow people to sleep in their homes and feel safe. And so as a result, there are tens of thousands of people sleeping outside in camps like refugees, with no real plan or place to go because, again, the government hasn't really decided to evacuate the area, move people to another location. The best they've been able to do is set up some tents where they could go inside and sleep. But most people are sleeping outside or in their cars or in tents. And here in Philadelphia, the group Philly Boricuas, which Fermin and many of us have been supporting, has been organizing a relief effort, right, to collect donations, supplies, emergency backpacks to send to Puerto Rico. So as a result of this campaign, we've been able to send over 1,000 pounds of supplies to Puerto Rico. So I want to give a special shout out to Adrian and Pucci, who are in our group. They flew to Puerto Rico this week to distribute the goods and to talk with relief workers there. And they've been sending the goods in boxes and bins all week long and working with locals on the ground to pick up those goods. The reason why we've been doing that is because of all of the things that happened during Hurricane Maria, where goods never reached the island. A lot of boxes were opened up and stolen. They were not given to the right people. People kept them. There was a lot of craziness happening with the distribution of supplies coming from the United States to Puerto Rico. So because of that mistrust, a lot of groups like ours have decided to just do it ourselves. That way we can ensure that the aid gets there. And so on Saturday, news broke that there are over a dozen warehouses, like giant warehouses, full of emergency supplies. And these supplies were some of the same things that we were collecting from people here in Philadelphia. So lots of pallets of water, like it looked like hundreds of thousands of bottles of water. They had diapers, baby formula, first aid supplies, emergency blankets. There was the gas stoves and the propane tanks. And here's the sad part. The sad part is this story was broken by a blogger, right? A blogger went to investigate. He had heard about this and he was like going all around Ponce to look for it. And he's the one that found it. The reason that we know that these warehouses exist is because of this one guy who looked into it and went into that warehouse on Facebook Live to expose it. And after he exposed it, they tried to kick him out. They tried to make him leave. But then something remarkable happened. All these people from the town came to the warehouse and they busted it open, right? They had a crowbar and they busted that garage door open. And again, they showed all the goods that had been sitting there. And the other sad thing is that when they started looking at the items, they noticed a lot of them were expired and that they had been sitting there since Hurricane Maria. So for over 2 years, these items have been sitting in those warehouses. And the one in Ponce is just one of them. But then, it's been reported that there are over a dozen other warehouses all over the island with these emergency supplies. And so that's the reason why people have taken to the streets again this weekend. And on Martin Luther King Day, there was a paro nacional, which is a general strike. And people are still, even today, outside the governor's mansion, the Fortaleza, to demand accountability for this. Because the real problem is that during Hurricane Maria and its aftermath and the rebuilding of the island, and now during this earthquake, the government had the ability to distribute these goods. And for some reason, we don't know, they didn't. And there's documents now that are emerging, again, going back to that original Center for Investigative Journalism investigation, that show that Wanda Vasquez indeed had knowledge of the existence of these warehouses before. And her chief of staff came out yesterday and today and said that she's claiming that allegedly Wanda Vasquez did have knowledge. Again, she absolutely knew that these warehouses full of supplies existed. So I think the biggest question on everyone's mind is, why were they not giving these important goods and supplies to people who needed it badly, who were literally suffering and dying because they didn't have what they need? It's the question on everybody's mind. Before we end, I want you to talk about Philly Boricua and to just invite people on how they can participate. Again, we try to summarize a lot in this 1 hour show, but there's still a lot going on here in Philadelphia locally. And also there's always this connection between us here in Philadelphia with the Puerto Rican community here, and also the connection that we have to our families and friends on the island.
Well, you have to realize that in every nation that you live around the world, there's always a diaspora of people that come from another place. And they play a role in the nation that they came from because they have family members. They have things also. They may not left a home in that place they came from. But most of all, they have family members that they want to see the well-being of them. Some of us want them to stay there so they could prosper there. And so we play a role in helping them out. In history, when nations that were colonized became free, the diaspora of those nations, wherever they were, whether it was the Algerians in France, whether it was the Irish in Great Britain, whether it was the Puerto Ricans in the United States, played a role in the liberation of their country, or played a role in a better standard and a better understanding, but in reality, a liberation of their country when they were in the diaspora. So what we're trying to do here in the diaspora is to educate people on the island, on the issue that Puerto Rico is a U.S. colony, and why liberation and why we have to end colonialism in Puerto Rico is important. But we want people to be mobilized, to do something not only for the community of Puerto Rico, but their communities here who are also affected by colonialism because they come in with a colonized mind. They come in with a mind that they're set that they can't do things on their own, which they really can. And they have to do it collectively as a group of people, as a nation of people. And that's what we try to do, is educate people. We have a Facebook page. We want you to get on the Facebook page to know that we're sending supplies to Puerto Rico on the issue of the earthquake that just happened. Get on our Facebook page and read what we're all about. But also get involved. And we have activities. We want you to come to those activities. And we want you to show up, and we want you to educate yourself. We want you to get involved. We want you to learn. But most of all, ask questions. Ask questions. Don't be afraid to learn about who you are as a Puerto Rican. And stop being afraid of that, because that's the problem. That's where you get yourself in a bind and you get yourself in a worse situation, that you don't want to learn about yourself. And that's why you got low self-esteem. Get that low self-esteem out of you and learn who your poets are, who your fighters are, who made history. Women that made history in Puerto Rico, and learn to love yourself for who you are and wake up loving yourself as a Puerto Rican. Thank you.
Well, that's a good message to end on. I want to give a special thank you to Fermin Morales. He's a community organizer here in Philly. He organizes with Philly Boricuas. And again, you can visit their Facebook or Instagram, philly.boricuas. And there's also a website where you can get information on how to participate, how to donate. And there's a survey on there that we really want people to fill out. So again, I want to thank you for watching and listening to the People Power Lunch Hour show. That's going to do it for this week. Next month is Black History Month. We have some really great interviews and topics to cover then. Thank you so much for watching.
Hello, my name is Andre Ward. I'm the Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy at the Fortune Society. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines